the Ashton Arnold Jewish Studies program, which is now celebrating its 27th anniversary here at the College of Charleston. The theme for our public programming for 2011 and 2012 is Jews and Social Justice. It's a year-long initiative made possible by a nationally competitive and generous grant secured by Jewish Studies faculty member Adam Mendelson from the Legacy Heritage Jewish Studies Project, directed by the Association for Jewish Studies. It's a sequel grant to last year's project on Jews, slavery, and the Civil War. Our motto at Jewish Studies is Midor Lador, from generation to generation. The prophetic vision of justice and the biblical imperative to pursue it is one of the strongest bridges between generations. From pre-boomer to millennial, so many Jews today are committed to making the world a better place. One of the objectives of our mission is to give all these people a Jewish narrative, Jewish historicity, and a Jewish vocabulary for their efforts at Tikkun Olam. We see our programming on Jews and social justice as much an exercise in consciousness raising as one of public education and entertainment. Our aim is to court a constituency that rarely engages with Jewish life, to establish new and more varied partnerships with groups on campus and within the Charleston community, and focus attention for our regular constituency to contemporary concerns of social justice. Rabbi Joe Jacobs, who is in this room, is kicking off the Jews and Social Justice series tonight at the 2011-2012 Milton and Freddie Kronsberg Memorial Lecture, which we're honored to co-host with the Kronsberg family. Tonight, Rabbi Jacobs presents Judaism and Social Justice, New Fad or Ancient Tradition, and will explore the religious, political, social, and cultural roots of social justice in the Jewish tradition, and examine the place of the contemporary American Jewish social justice movement in the trajectory of Jewish history and thought. During Family Weekend, Jewish Studies, I should have had an extra beer. During Family Weekend, a Jewish Studies community liaison, Jess Glasser, is moderating a panel promoting a culture of inclusion, lessons from the Holocaust, and discussing the Holocaust and its continuing impact on the lives and those who are touched by it, with Charleston's own Holocaust survivor, Joe Engel, and social activist Armand Durfman. I might add, by the way, that program is filled at 200 people. It has no more slots available. September 25th, the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Education at the College of Charleston is hosting Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel for 2 events on campus. A student panel on living in a fractured world, moderated by Ted Rosengarten at noon, and a lecture entitled Don't Stand Idly By at 6 p.m., both events at Sertilli Theater. Those interested in tickets to overflow venues to either event should see Eden Idelson in the back of the room after the presentation. On October 23rd, Edith Klein will be our Sunday morning speaker addressing risk and responsibility of professional queer Jews' take on activism. Ms. Klein will be leading a community organizing workshop for students and local activists in the afternoon following the talk. Our hallmark event, our 3-rabbi panel, will also address the issue of Jews and social justice on Wednesday, November 2nd, and it will be followed by 3 Christian clergymen addressing Christianity and social justice on Thursday, November 17th. And on December 4th, we will be hosting 2 professionals from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Gideon Aronoff, their executive director, will be sharing 5 reasons why American Jews should care about immigration in 2011 as part of our Sunday morning series. And Lisa Liza Lieberman from HIAS's DC office will be facilitating an interactive program considering the current immigration debate from a Jewish values and historical perspective that afternoon. In the spring, we plan to host scholars and activists to speak about food, labor, and environmental justice from a Jewish perspective, as well as the social justice activist movement in Israel. Back to tonight, and our speaker, Rabbi Jill Jacobs. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the Executive Director of Rabbis for Human Rights North America. She is the author of Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community, and There Shall Be No Needy, Pursuing Social Justice Through Jewish Law and Tradition, both of which are on sale in the back of this room. If you'd like Rabbi Jacobs to sign a copy for you after tonight's talk, she'll be happy to do so. Rabbi Jacobs has twice been named to the Forward 50, Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews, in 2008 and again in 2010, to the Jewish Week's first list of 36 under 36 in 2008, and to Newsweek's the 50 most influential rabbis in America in 2009, in 2010, and again in 2011. She lives in New York with her husband Guy Austrian and their daughter Leora. The Kronsberg Lecture Series began in fall of 1999, honoring the Kronsberg lifelong commitment to Jewish ideas and values, and bringing world professionals and thought leaders to the College of Charleston. The Kronsberg connection to Jewish studies is deep and continuing. Please join me in welcoming Mickey Kronsberg Rosenblum to the stage to introduce Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you so much to all of you, to Marty and to Jess and to Enid, and thank you to all of you for your patience. Apparently there's some hurricane or something going on this week, so thank you so much for waiting. My first real activism happened in high school. I was a junior in high school, and my high school principal was quoted in the local paper saying that there was no teen pregnancy problem in our school. And I was kind of a smart aleck kid, so I decided to do a little bit of research. And I found out that actually we had one of the highest teen pregnancy rates and also one of the highest rates of sexually transmitted diseases in Massachusetts. This was a public school about 30 miles west of Boston. And I also found out that we were one of only 2 or 3 schools in the entire state that didn't have any sex education. So I thought these 2 bits of information were not disconnected. So I got a few friends together and we started a campaign to get sex education in our school and also to get condoms to be available in the nurse's office. Now this was, as I said, a public school, a very large public school about 30 miles west of Boston, very Catholic, very conservative area. So this was not the most popular campaign that students ever decided to take up. And I found in the course of the work there was the whole wrath of the Catholic Church came down on me and my friends, the wrath of the local born-again church. And as we were negotiating, and my friends were, some were Jewish, some were Catholic, we came from all sorts of different backgrounds. All sorts of different backgrounds in Boston means that you're either Jewish or you're Irish or you're Italian or you're Latino. Until I was, I actually thought the Protestants were a minority group until I graduated from high school. So, as I was doing this work, I realized that there was something Jewish about it for me, but I couldn't identify what it was. I certainly had no idea that Jewish women had been involved in reproductive rights work since that work began in the United States. I I didn't know that Jews have been involved in social justice for generations, for really centuries. I didn't know any of that. I just had this sense that there was something about this work that connected it with something that maybe I had learned in my family or in Hebrew school once upon a time. But I couldn't really say any more than that. And for me, that really continued until I got to rabbinical school. I went through college having social justice commitments, having Jewish commitments, and not seeing any connection between the two. And then finally, I got to rabbinical school. I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. That's the conservative movement's rabbinical school in New York. And when I got there, something that I noticed about the building was that it stood on the edge of, on the one hand, on one side of it, there was a whole world of academia. Columbia and Barnard and Union Theological Seminary were there. And on the other side, there was Harlem, which at least at the time was fairly low income and African American. And I noticed about the building that it only opened on one side. You could only get in through a door on one side. And that door pointed toward Columbia. It didn't point toward Harlem. And so it felt to me like the school was open to academia, but closed on three sides to the neighborhood. And so I decided that I was going to find out what was going on in the neighborhood, that I had to be involved in my neighborhood if I was going to be there for 5 years. And so I ended up getting involved in an organization that was working with tenants who were being evicted from their homes because of some changes in New York City law at the time. And so then I started this very funny pattern where I would go over to Harlem. It was about a 10-minute walk from the school. I would sit down with a woman who was trying to get her landlord to turn on her hot water, or who was trying to avoid eviction. And then I would walk back to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I would be deep in a conversation about Shabbat, or about kashrut, or about sacrificial practice in the temple thousands of years ago. And I just couldn't connect it to what I was seeing in Harlem. And so I decided to do a little bit of research. And I opened up a chapter of Talmud and found myself deep in a conversation between rabbis 1,500 years ago about when you're allowed to evict somebody, about what repairs the landlord has to do and what repairs the tenant has to do. And I found that the rabbis were having the same exact conversations that were going on in Harlem 1,500 years later. The rabbis obviously didn't know that there would be a place called Harlem 1,500 years later, and the people I was working with in Harlem had no idea what the Talmud was or what the Talmud might say. And yet I found that we were actually in the same conversation. And so that's led me to a rabbinate that's about exploring what the connection is between Judaism and social justice and trying to make it something that actually has some there. So that we don't have Jews saying, yeah, I know there's something Jewish about social justice like I was in high school, but make sure that we can connect it deeply to our historical roots, to our legal roots, and to our communal roots. So what I want to do is I want to talk about Judaism and social justice from 4 perspectives. First, I want to talk about it from the historical experience. Then I want to talk about Judaism and social justice through a legal lens. I want to talk about it through what the Jewish vision is of the world to come, and then I want to address some practical matters about what it means to do social justice as Jews in our world now. When you ask Jews about Jewish history, what most of us know is we know that according to the biblical narrative, we're a people who came out of slavery. We might know that we're people who've been kicked out of all sorts of places, that we had our temple destroyed, that Jerusalem was destroyed, that we were expelled from Spain and Portugal and England and many other places. We know, of course, about the Holocaust in our own time. We know that most of our families came to the United States as immigrants, so we know a little bit about the immigrant experience. Perhaps we know that in the United States we established some of the first labor unions. We might know that we have been deeply involved in justice movements since the time we came to the United States. Jews who are involved in social justice work often trace their commitments to this history. Often I'll talk to people who are involved in immigration work, and I'll say, why do you do it? And they'll say, well, my grandmother came here as an immigrant. Or I'll talk to people who are involved in labor work, and they'll say, well, my grandfather was in a labor union, or I learned from my parents that you never cross a picket line. So we have these memories in us. And I want to suggest that these memories are not just nice memories that maybe compel some of us as individuals to do social justice work, but actually that our history is obligatory. When we talk about what it means as Jews to have come forth from slavery in Egypt, we say, well, of course, because we came out of slavery and were liberated and we tasted both slavery and liberation, therefore we have to help other people who are vulnerable. That's true. It's in the Torah. Multiple times we're told that because we came out of slavery, we have to help the immigrant, we have to help the widow, we have to help those who are in poverty, we have to help the orphan. So that's true. In the Jewish community, it's become a little bit of a cliche, actually, to throw out that line, that because we were slaves, we have to help others. But I want to point out that it's actually not, it's a very powerful statement, and it's actually not an obvious statement. It's not at all obvious that people who have experienced oppression would then turn that experience around to taking care of others. We think about the proverbial bully in the schoolyard. We think about that person as a kid who maybe doesn't get enough love at home, who maybe is abused at home, and then takes out his or her anger at other people. So it would be very easy for us to say, well, we were oppressed in Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt. We were killed in the Shoah. We were killed in so many places in history. We were kicked out of so many countries, and therefore what we learned from that experience is we won't trust anybody else. We won't take care of anybody else. We're just going to take care of ourselves. We actually learn the exact opposite. Starting with the Torah, we learn that that experience obligates us and other people don't experience the oppression that we experience. So that's something very special, and like I said, it's not an obvious statement. When we think about history as Americans, we don't usually think about it as obligatory. In all of my years of high school history, we learned about the Revolutionary War, actually it was Boston, we never really got past the Revolutionary War. We have the colonial period, the Revolutionary War. I think between junior and senior year we got a book to read over the summer about the Civil War, which I'm told I can't actually call it that here. I never studied it anyway. But it was just information. It was information, and we maybe were told that line about if you don't study history, you'll repeat it. But nobody ever said history is obligatory. Nobody ever said because Americans went through the experience of revolution and independence, therefore we have some commitment to other independence movements in the world. Nobody ever said that sentence. It wasn't part of our historical thinking. And yet, that very sentence is very much part of the Jewish experience. We sit around the Seder table every single year and we say, we used to be slaves, now we're free. We talk about the people who are still enslaved now, and we think about how we can make both ourselves more free and other people in the world more free. So I just want to say that's not something we take for granted. It's not an obvious statement that history is obligatory, but in the Jewish community, history is obligatory. That comes out very strongly in one particular line in the Seder. There's a line in the Haggadah that says, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim." That in every generation, every single one of us is obligated to see ourselves as though we personally have come forth from Egypt. That is, when we sit around the Seder table, we don't say, oh, this happened to my great, 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 etc. grandparents. We say, this happened to me. I was liberated. And we tell our children, because I was liberated, therefore we're sitting around the Seder table today. There's actually another version of that statement in the Sephardic Haggadah. In that version, instead of saying that each of us is obligated lirot et atzmo, that each person is obligated to see him or herself as having come forth from slavery, this version says that each person is obligated laharot et atzmo, to show oneself as having come forth from slavery. So what does it mean to show ourselves as coming forth from slavery? Showing ourselves means that we do more than talk about our past experience. It also means that we act in the world in such a way that everybody who encounters us personally or the Jewish community as a whole says, oh, that's a people who understand slavery and oppression. That's a people who's working to bring about liberation. So we have this nice contrast, or really complement, between, on the one hand, an obligation to see ourselves as people who have come forth from slavery, to tell those stories, to tell them to our children, to own them as our experience, never to take for granted what we have, and then to move beyond that and also to show ourselves in the world as people who understand oppression and who are working to bring about liberation. And when we show ourselves as people who are working for liberation, then what our children see is, oh, my parents understand oppression. This becomes their experience. They now can see themselves as people who have also experienced oppression and liberation, and the cycle continues. So the first motivation for Jews to do social justice is a historical one, the idea that history brings about obligations. The second motivation is a legal one. When we talk about Jewish law, often what comes to mind is ritual practices. We think about Shabbat, what we do or don't. Truth, what we do or don't eat. We think that what it means to be an observant Jew is that we follow all the laws of the holidays, that we keep kosher, that we follow every single one of the ritual practices. And that's an important part of being Jewish. Ritual is certainly an important part of my life and an important part of Jewish community. But actually in Judaism, when we talk about halakha, the word that's usually translated as Jewish law, what it actually means is the way to walk. It comes from the Hebrew verb lalechet, to go, to walk. Meaning that halakha is a means of guiding every single moment of our days, not just what we put in our mouths, but also what we pay our workers. Not only what we do or we don't do on Saturdays, but also our relationships with the people around us. When we think about social justice work, whether that means volunteering, whether it means working for better legislation, we often talk about it in terms of altruism. But Judaism doesn't actually speak in terms of altruism. Judaism speaks in terms of responsibility. Judaism says that we have a responsibility to create the civil society that we want to create. Just give you one example. A few years ago, the conservative movement passed a tshuva, a legal position that I wrote, that says that employers have to pay their workers a living wage. And it also says that employers have to allow their workers to make their own decisions about unionizing, and that employers have to create a dignified workplace. It was a very, very long process of getting this legal position passed. And in this process, which took, I think it really took basically 5 years. I wrote it in 2003, it passed in 2008. And it goes through many, many readings of a particular committee that passes all of the laws that then become the responsibility, the obligation on conservative Jewish communities around the country. And in the conversations, the number one question that kept coming up is this our role? This was a committee that's used to dealing with questions like, can you add an extra aliyah when you have a bar mitzvah? Can you have an extra Torah reading? Can you use electricity on Shabbat? Can you use musical instruments on Shabbat? These are the questions that usually come to the committee. So they're mostly, almost all ritual questions. And so there are a few people on the committee who are saying, well, this isn't our business. We're a committee that deals with Jewish law. The committee is called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. They said, we're a committee that deals with Jewish law. This isn't Jewish law. The tshuva, of course, was argued deeply from Jewish law, from Jewish text, from Jewish civil law. And in our conversations, what the committee eventually decided is, yes, of course, just because Jewish civil law hasn't been the center of how we think about halakha, how we think about Jewish law, how we thought about it historically, that doesn't mean that this isn't the business of a Committee on Jewish Law and Standards to take up both ritual law and civil law. Another objection that kept coming up is, well, how do you cut into the program budgets of our communities? How are we going to make the decision about whether we're paying the janitor a few extra dollars an hour and whether we have extra money for kiddush, or whether we have money to send another kid to camp or another kid to an Israel summer program? These aren't easy questions at all. But one of the things that we talked about in these conversations is that sometimes you do Jewish law, not because it's cheap, not because it's easy, but because it's actually a responsibility that's ingrained in halakha, in the way that we walk in the world. So for example, many synagogues certainly conservative and Orthodox synagogues buy kosher food even though it's more expensive, because that's a value. We ask families who are having a wedding or having a bar or bat mitzvah to get kosher food even though it costs more money, because we say, well, that's part of Jewish law. El Al, which is the national airline of the state of Israel, doesn't fly on Shabbat. You can fly to Israel on Shabbat. You can fly Delta on Shabbat. You can fly Continental to Israel on Shabbat. You can get to Israel on Shabbat, but you can't get there on El Al. Now, I don't even know how many millions of dollars El Al loses every single year because they don't fly on Shabbat. But I do know that that was a value decision made at some point, that this particular Jewish value is more important than making more money. So when we accept Jewish law as obligatory, when we accept Jewish civil law as a responsibility and not just as something nice, sometimes it's not the easiest business decision, and sometimes it doesn't make our lives any easier. But it's a way of saying that doing the right thing in the world is an obligation, it's a responsibility that's ingrained inside what it means to be Jewish. And through this work, we're not just doing a nice thing now, but we're actually working toward creating a society that works for all of its members. We're working toward creating a more just society. So that brings me to the third category. We've talked about the historical imperative, we've talked about the legal imperative. I want to talk a little bit about the vision that Judaism lays out for us about what the world could be. As somebody who does social justice work professionally, I have to tell you it's really frustrating. There's so many times that I'll work on a piece of legislation for months or years, and then it fails. And then it feels like all of the work of the past several years was for nothing because the effort failed. Sometimes it feels like all we can get is little incremental change. So maybe we pass one law that has a little bit of an effect on a few people, but it's very hard to pass some law that's going to have a massive, massive effect on everybody in this country, let alone everybody in the world. So it gets frustrating. And for me, the thing that keeps me going is the sense that in Judaism we're working toward a vision of something better, that each of our individual actions brings us a little bit closer to this perfected world. In the Bible, the prophets imagine that someday there's going to be this perfected world. We can call it messianic, we can call it perfected, whatever language you like to use, where everybody has what he or she needs, where we have peace, where there's nobody who is really, really far on the bottom, and there's nobody who has so much power that they use it to oppress other people. In mystical thought, we have an image of tikkun olam. We have an image that once upon a time, the world was perfect. The world was absolutely filled with divinity, and that the work of human beings is to put that divinity back in place. So the work of human beings is to bring us back to that perfected state. In Judaism, we don't have a conclusive description of what this perfected state of the world is going to look like. We have hundreds and thousands of years of arguments about what the messianic world might look like, but we don't have any agreement. And that's really to keep us focused on the practical, to keep us focused on the here and now. If we get too carried away in just imagining this perfected world, then maybe we'll abandon what we're doing now. But rather, we have on the one hand a vision of what could be, and on the other hand, the instructions, the responsibility to deal with what is now. For me, that comes out the most in one particular biblical passage that I actually named my first book after. In this biblical passage from the book of Deuteronomy, it's actually one that we just read a couple of weeks ago, God says to the people, "Efes ki lo yadecha avyon," that there will be no needy, there shall be no needy among you. And then just a few lines later, God says, the poor will never cease from the land. You have to take care of the poor because they'll never go away. There's a very long and complicated discussion about how we interpret these lines, how we interpret this paradox between, on the one hand, there won't be any poor, and on the other hand, the poor will never cease. The answer, there's one answer that is the classic answer that I don't love, which says, well, God knows that we're just not going to follow the instructions. God knows that we're just going to screw up from the beginning. And so God says, yeah, if you do everything right, there won't be any poor, but I know you're going to screw up, so I'm going to tell you what to do. So I don't like that explanation, because I don't like the idea that God knows that God's giving us instructions that that God already knows we won't follow. The interpretation I like better comes from Ramban, Nachmanides' medieval commentator, who says the following. He says, there is a possibility in every generation that we're going to be able to get rid of poverty. But the possibility of poverty always exists. And so we can't ever let down our guard in working toward this better world, because let's imagine that for 1 year we create a world where there's no poverty. It's hard to imagine, but let's imagine. If we start to think that that's the norm and that we don't have to worry about poverty coming back, then guess what? The next year we're going to find ourselves back in poverty. And so what he suggests is that on the one hand, we have to keep this vision that it is possible to create a world where nobody is suffering. On the other hand, we have to day to day keep our eye on who's suffering now, take care of those people, but also not get so sucked into worrying about the here and now that we don't keep any vision of how to get to this better world. So that's what Judaism gives us, really as a gift to those of us who do social justice work, to say to us, look, it seems hard, it's a slog now, it feels like progress is really slow, but we're holding out this vision that there is a perfect world that generations and generations of effort will get us to. So that's a third Jewish basis for social justice, that there's a vision of a perfected world. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about practical matters. When people hear that I'm a rabbi who does social justice, when people hear that I run an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights, the first thing they say is, well, do you work on Jewish issues? And my answer is, I don't understand the question. I really just don't understand the question. I try to be a little bit nicer than that, but but for me, there's not a distinction in our world between what's a Jewish issue and what's not a Jewish issue. So if I think about something like public school, I grew up going to public school, and despite all the issues I talked about with my public school, it's actually a very good place, and I learned a lot, and it let me get into the college I wanted to get into, and so I feel grateful that we have a system of public education in our country. And whether or not I decide to send my daughter to public school, if I send her to public school, then of course I want the public schools to be as good as they can be, and if I don't, I still want her growing up in a world where her neighbors and her peers and her bosses, her employees maybe, are people who have a good education. So is public education about Jews or is it about non-Jews? If we think about poverty issues, if we think about elder care, if we think about health care, are those Jewish issues or they're not Jewish issues? We certainly in my conversations with Jewish communities around the country, when I ask people what keeps them up at night, the two things I hear the most are health care. If I lose my job, I'm not going to have health care. Or I already lost my job and you wouldn't believe what the COBRA payments are. Or I'm worried about my own care as I grow older. Or I'm taking care of my elderly parents and I have children at home. I'm part of the sandwich generation and we don't really have a good system for taking care of issues that are in Jewish communities. Are they Jewish issues? They're not issues that we can deal with just in the Jewish community. They're issues that we have to deal with more globally. So for me, there's not a distinction between what's a Jewish issue and what's a non-Jewish issue because we don't live in a place where we only deal with Jews. Even if we live in Israel, we're still living in a world where what Jews do and what other people do has an impact on each other. I want to give one other practical example of why I think it's important for Jewish communities to be involved in justice issues and why I think there's not a dichotomy between what's our issue and what's not. A few years ago, I was working in Chicago for a local social justice organization. One of the programs we had was a Jewish-Muslim community building project. And we would work together on issues that were meaningful to both of us. In particular, this was a few years after September 11th, and we were very concerned about civil liberties issues, about what was going on with the Patriot Act. And for Jews, for the people in the Jewish community, we remembered that Jews were, of course, targeted during the anti-communist era, that Jews have certainly, we worry a lot about our own civil liberties. And so we were concerned about this from a historical perspective because history is obligatory. And our Muslim friends were worried about it from a very personal perspective because they were worried about people having to register and about people potentially getting deported, people putting on watch lists because they had a similar name to somebody else. And so we were working on civil liberties issues with this Muslim community. One day we woke up to the news that a local synagogue had been vandalized overnight, that somebody had come and painted swastikas in the synagogue. And it was a situation, it was a kid, it wasn't, in the big picture, it wasn't a huge deal. But somebody had painted swastikas in this local synagogue. We get this phone call from our Muslim partners. They said, all right, we're going to come up. We're going to tell us what you need paint. We're going to come up and we're going to help paint it over. Okay, so it's a very small example. Nobody's life was at stake in this example. But it was a moment when I realized that because we're working on this issue that some people might not recognize as a Jewish issue right now, it means that the people we're working with have a relationship with us, and they're going to be there when we need them. This is something that the Jewish community in America, as we've gotten farther and farther into the upper middle class, that we've sometimes forgotten. It's very easy for us to just ally ourselves with the people who are in power. It's very easy for us to say, well, we're at the tops of universities, we're in pretty much every layer of government. We don't have a situation where Jews can't get into universities, where Jews can't work in banks. We're just not in that world, and so we don't need to worry about forming alliances with the people who are still more vulnerable. But the answer is that we do. That those are our natural allies, the other minority groups who often are vulnerable, because that's who's going to come to our aid because we were there for them. So there are some very, very practical reasons for Jews to do social justice in partnership with other communities. So I said that the Jewish roots of social justice are historical, that history imposes obligations. I've said that our legal system, the halakha, tells us that we have certain responsibilities for creating a just society. I've said that Judaism gives us a vision of what a perfected world might look like. And I've also said that there are some very practical matters, that we want to work to create the world where we want to live, and we also want to make sure that we're partnered with communities who are going to come to our assistance when we need it. Some people might say, okay, well, that's fine, but why do we have to do this work as Jews? I mean, if you want any organization working on social justice advocacy, you're going to find, start talking to those Jews and you push them, there's something Jewish about it. Like I said, that something might be a little bit vague, but they'll say there's something Jewish about it. So why do we need to do this work as JCCs in the context of Jewish community? It's true that the work that we do as Jews in Jewish communities can't possibly replace the work that individual Jews are doing as people who are in high positions in social justice organizations, because those organizations work on justice issues all the time. And we as Jewish communities can do justice, certainly as part of what we do, but we also have other jobs and other things that we're doing in our community. So social justice work in the Jewish community can't replace what other people are doing. But at the same time, I think that doing social justice work for our synagogues, through our schools, our JCCs, our camps, and other institutions is absolutely crucial for us as Jews in America. First of all, when we engage our institutions in social justice, we create a space where we can live full and integrated Jewish lives. We're very used to having a dichotomy between what's our Jewish life and what's our regular life. So we think, oh, I'm going to go to synagogue on Saturday morning and I'll do my Jewish thing, and then I'm going to go to work on Monday morning and that's my secular thing. But as I said, halakha isn't just about what we do on Saturday morning. It's not just about what we ate for breakfast. Halakha is also about the conversation that we had with our child or with our parents and how we treated that person. Halakha is also about how we make decisions in the workplace. Halakha is also about how we spend our money, whether we give tzedakah, how we steward our money in a responsible way. And ritual, Jewish ritual, is not only about doing ritual because it's a relationship between us and God. Ritual is also something that's supposed to push us out into the world. So I think, for example, say, whenever we have a prayer service, we'll say all sorts of prayers that give thanks to God for what God does for us in taking care of our needs. So for instance, in the morning blessings in Birkat HaShachar, we thank God, for example, for freeing those who are enslaved, for freeing those who are in captivity. And we give thanks to God for taking care of all of our needs. We give thanks to God for clothing those who need clothing. Now when I read those, of course I think, I'm really lucky. I have everything that I need. I'm a free person. I have clothing. I basically don't want for anything. There's nothing that I absolutely need that I don't have. So I'm grateful for that. But those blessings aren't just about me being grateful. They're also about me saying, well, if I'm going to be a partner with God in the world, how do I make sure that everybody else has whatever they need? So even the very language of our liturgy pushes us out into the world. When I think about creating an integrated Jewish life, what I think about is a life where our ritual practices push us into the world. Where when I say blessings that thank God for what God has done for me, and I also think, well, what responsibility do we have in the world? When I think about Shabbat, one of the rationales for Shabbat is that we used to be slaves, and now we're free, and free people can have to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We take one day off, at the very least, to say, we're free, we have control over this time. Well, that day should also force me to say, well, who else in the world isn't free? And how do I, in the other 6 days a week, how do I go about making sure those people also have their freedom? So our ritual pushes us outward, and then when we get so exhausted with the world, and when we get so exhausted with how difficult it is to try to do justice in the world, we can come back into our ritual. We have time to meditate, we have time to pray, we have time to be in community, we have time to take off time for Shabbat, and that gives us the sustenance to then continue the work in the world. So doing justice work in the context of a Jewish community lets us live an integrated Jewish life. Second, doing justice work builds community. For many of us, it's really scary to walk into a synagogue. Maybe we don't know Hebrew. Maybe the last time we were in a synagogue was for our bar bat mitzvah. Justice work is often the way that people get back into synagogue life. In one particular synagogue that I've done some work with, I remember the story of one woman who I met who had no connection to the synagogue whatsoever. She was terrified of walking into services. She started getting involved in the social justice work. She started building a community. She started realizing that justice work was only one part of living an integrated Jewish life, and she ended up having a bat mitzvah at age 40. And she ended up starting to read Torah for the synagogue. She ended up becoming part of that community in many ways far beyond what was happening in the social justice world. Because for her, it was about creating a whole community and not only about engaging in one piece of it. Religious communities have power. I saw that really in New York through the debate about same-sex marriage, which, thank God, passed at the end of June, as you probably know. In that whole debate, it often was framed as there are the religious institutions that say that same-sex marriage is forbidden, and there are the secular people who want to allow it, or maybe it was said in not-so-nice terms. There's one story from one synagogue, B'nai Jeshurun, a very large synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, that a few members went to visit one state representative, and this was somebody who was voting against the bill. And they went in to see him, and they said, we want to talk about this bill that's coming up. And he said, well, I don't know, I mean, I'm a religious person, how would I explain it to my mother, and I just, doesn't the Bible say that you can't have two men marry each other? And the people who were there said, we're religious, we're Jewish, now we're going to tell you our stories. One of them talked about her son who was married to his partner, who was British. The partner was British. The partner couldn't get a visa, so they had to move back to the UK because they couldn't live in the United States. And she said, I just want my son to come home. I want to pass this bill. I want same-sex marriage because I want my son and his partner to be able to come home. They talked about why They talked about why in the Jewish tradition we do allow, at least in liberal communities, for same-sex marriage, and they talked about it as Jews, as religious people, and that made a difference. That particular representative ended up voting for the bill. Now, I can't say that it was that visit that did it, but I think that it was significant to have religious people come out and say, this is a religious obligation. And it means a lot when a rabbi stands up at a rally or goes to the State House and says, I represent, let's say, 500 Jewish families, and I want to tell you why we stand behind such and such a bill. At Rabbis for Human Rights, we've been working very hard on human trafficking, on stopping human trafficking in the United States. And a few months ago, a bill came up in Washington State. So we asked one of the rabbis who's involved with us in Washington State, in Olympia, Washington, to go to the State House. And he got up and he talked about the Jewish experience of slavery. And he talked about why in the Jewish tradition there's an obligation to end slavery. Again, I can't say that the bill passed because this one particular rabbi got up and spoke in the State House, but I know that he got up and spoke. I know that it was received as a powerful statement. Religious communities have power. And then finally, when we as Jews speak publicly about justice work as Jews, we actually transform the notion of what Jews do. A lot of times when people think about Jews, they might say, well, those are those people who don't eat pork, or yeah, they celebrate Hanukkah. What I want people to say, what Jews do is Jews fight for justice in the world as Jews, based in Jewish history and based in Jewish tradition. So when we come to a social justice movement and say, we are here as a Jewish community because this is what our tradition says that we do, that's very different than my coming and saying, I'm a Jew, I'm an individual person. It's very different when I come with 10, 20, 100 people. It's very different when I say, I'm standing here as a representative of a synagogue. I'm standing here as a representative of a school because this is what Jews do. I started by saying that many of us have a sense that there's something Jewish about social justice, but perhaps that connection feels vague or feels forced or feels new. But actually, social justice is built into the very fabric of our tradition from the beginning. It's not something that's vague, it's something that's incredibly strong, and I believe that we as Jewish communities, when we act on our social justice values and our social justice history, that we actually have incredible power to bring about the vision of the world that our tradition says is possible. Thank you. In back there in the orange, and maybe say your name.
Okay, my name's Mimi. I'm wondering, one of my frustrations is I feel often in speaking with other Jews and talking about Jewish roots of social justice, that's not well received, or they aren't convinced that there is a Jewish call to social justice. I'm wondering how you feel about that approach, that like, no, it's not Jewish, sorry, Judaism is kashrut, and also, is that a conversation you're willing to engage in with someone from a different perspective?
Yeah, first of all, I'm definitely willing to engage in it. That's actually why I wrote my first book, There Shall Be No Needy, which looks at specific issues in American life through a Jewish perspective. So I look at criminal justice, I look at poverty, I look at labor issues, I look at housing, I look at the environment, because I felt like a lot of times the conversations about Judaism and social justice felt really, really vague, and so there would be people who would basically say, well, I believe X, Y, and Z, and I'm Jewish, so it must be a Jewish thing, and then there would be other people who would say there's no root for Judaism in that. And so I wanted to take on some issues and to be able to say, okay, well, let's actually look at what Judaism says about labor relations, and let's actually look at what Judaism says about criminal justice. And there's really generations of texts running from biblical times to the modern day of struggling with these very issues. And I think that in conversations about Judaism and social justice, what I want to do is just sit down and study texts together. So let's say, all right, you don't think there's anything Jewish about social justice, let's pick an issue, and let's look at some texts together and let's talk about it.
And then what would you say to the response, which is often, well, yes, this text exists, but also they stone people for X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I think that's what makes Judaism interesting, is that, not that we stone people, but that we have a historical conversation. So something that, when we use text for social justice, something that's often done that I don't like is we figure out what we think, and then we find a text that's going to support that. And the way that I like the issues, with justice issues in Judaism, is to say, let's really look at all of the texts, and let's have a conversation among them, and let's look at also the history of interpretation. So when I think about something like, you said, stone people, well, that was essentially legislated out. That's part of Jewish tradition, that every generation responds to what was done before and can say, okay, we're gonna take, and this we'll find a way to legislate out. So already by the time the system of the Bible was totally redone in such a way to make it very, very difficult to convict somebody, certainly to do capital punishment. And so those are the conversations I want to have. I want to say, yeah, let's bring a hard text, let's bring an easy text, let's bring our own historical experience, let's have a conversation. Especially around labor, because people have really, really strong reactions to union issues. I've taught a lot of classes where at the beginning we'll go around the room and I'll say, tell me, we'll say, well, I'm an inside lawyer, and so I came because I want to know that Judaism supports unions. And so the person next to that person will say, well, I came because I'm a business owner and I hate unions. So if we just left it there, they would basically get into a fist fight. But I'll say, okay, fine, let's look at some text, and by the end of the conversation, they still basically disagree, or maybe have a little bit more of a nuanced perspective. So I saw, okay, so 1, 2.
My name is Arlene. I just want to comment and ask you how you can explain this sort of right-wing conservatism that we're seeing about shirking our responsibilities in terms of healthcare and the opposition to in order to get justice here. How do you explain that in the current?
Sure. How do we explain the rightward shift in the Jewish community? First of all, I'm not sure that the rightward shift is as much as we might think. In every election, there's this prediction that Jews are going to vote overwhelmingly Republican. Actually, the percentage of Jews who vote Democratic basically hasn't shifted. It's always hovered in every election for the last, I don't know how many years. But it's not just about voting one way or the other. It's also about how we think about money, how we think about our responsibilities, and about how far we've come from the immigrant experience and what our personal experiences are. There's something called the segregation index, which basically measures how likely you are to live next to somebody of a different race than you. And the thing that's amazing to me is that it's actually, right now, in 2011, you have less of a chance of living next to somebody of a different race than during the Civil Rights era. So we've actually managed, that's not just about Jews, it's about everybody in America, that we've managed to really seclude ourselves with people who have a similar socioeconomic status as us, who have similar ethnicities, who are just very similar to us. And I think for Jews, as we've gotten wealthier as a community, as we've moved farther from the immigrant experience, as we can move into wealthier and wealthier suburbs, as we forget what it was like not to be able to live in certain places, or to go to certain hotels, then it's very easy to just start identifying with people who are in our same social and economic class. And I think that's a challenge of Judaism. That's really where I hope that our texts and our traditions bring us back, is to say, even if you can't remember even if you don't know the person, even if we have had no personal experience of oppression and personal experience of struggle, still, as Jews, we have to identify with this historical experience. So that's a challenge. So I said, okay, 2 hands, 1 behind the other. that Cynthia, is that right? Has seen a lot of Jewish communities work is really about sort of something that and my answer is yes and no. I do think that intention to taking care of other Jews, there's the intention to specifically Jewish, whether it's something going on in Israel, and issues that happen to be the pet issue of whoever's doing planning. That happens a lot. I think that the challenge is in discussion on community organizing coming up. In community organizing, there's a concept called self-interest, that people organize around their self-interest. Like, have to organize around self-interest, how we also benefit. It's about expanding our sense of what benefits us. So I gave the public school example. It's a lot of synagogues around the country doing community organizing right now, having conversations internally about what issues matter that are come up the most. Issues that let's set a help. That's possible. I think it is to say support whatever makes sense for that community, and we're going to acknowledge that we're doing it not because we're being nice to those other people. Like school example, one of my sad things was I was sitting in a sukkah in during the election where Bush got elected second. So it was during an election cycle. And, probably no job and which, you know, the knowledge Sukkot, sit down these Sukkot into the world, and anybody can come in. And I'm sitting and I was having a conversation with somebody, and he said, and I thought, you know, my response, what I said here is that I'll say my daughter is too young for school, but we're even if we did only the Jewish kids or only the kids who could, and so even though she gets into one particular good public school, I still my being afforded. I'm worried about the world that the challenge for us is really to expand our sense of self-interest, and that it's also about us, but it's not only. The Jewish social justice director of an organization that works in North 50, and I have this vision, and I grew up with this fantasy about Israel being this Jewish be put into practice, and it's a disappointment for those of us who spent time there, even for those of us who didn't. Not what happens. It happens in society, but That's not to say, I don't want to say, obviously that's not to excuse Palestinian terrorists, not on one side that's wrong. But I do think that I have a vision that Israel could be the most just place, and this is a place we're not living up to that. And by the way, if you're following protests going on, that's the other place. Israel was formed as a place that was going to take care of people, make sure that and Israel does have some social safety nets, but it also has anywhere in the Western world. And finally, the young people took to I went to medical so
vision. And I see that Americans serve us, and my children only see the people that have Americans serve us. On white descent in this religion. I remember when the earthquake happened in Haiti, and I was reading off the Bible. One of the questions was to Haiti in Israel. I remember reading, I don't remember where it was, Midrash or whatever, that the that you normally have to make sure that you're teaching your children to be Jewish, do that as well. I guess my or otherwise we were Genesis 12 with being increased and preparing how you teach your children in our work that
inner
in the Jewish community of work in all of it, externally to the community at large.
Okay, so two things. So first, of minorities, and this is something that all Jews are basically look white. Jews becoming white, we certainly are all Ashkenazi and Jews in the world. And so now we're realizing that Jews do have Jews have lived in India around the world. Some of because of adoptions. We are seeing a more cultural journey, so I hope it'll be so that there won't be any who are of a different race. So I hope that'll get better. But in terms of balancing, this is and it's not $5 most important. Thousands, millions of people around the world. I other one text that it's a text that when we're lending money becomes the problem. When we're lending money, if it's between a Jew money, we go to a person who's more somebody in our family and somebody not in our family. The choice between somebody in our town, we go for which from our town. So they're reading it. Maybe the same people stand. Every single one of them says, all right, if you're not get out, then we're going to sell your bank account below a certain level. Say who's actually related to me. Okay, let me get it. There we give all of our tzedakah. And that would be the person who said, let's give it to Israel. Maybe my cousin who keeps tzedakah. That's when we really doing that because it ends up that all of our money are really Jews in our town. So I don't like reading that way, and actually mine didn't like that way either. When you're on a very important level, and you're just going to have your behavior, and there's not going to. And so the way that he and others did is these are all we're sitting around thinking about how to deal with their responsibility to counts and the responsibility to community. And maybe if we have need within our families. So I think about a crazy, complicated formula. We basically set a New York, a percentage outside of New York, a certain percentage in a certain percent, and we say a certain percentage not. So we give a percentage to different kinds of injustice, whether it's service. To say, not a perfect solution. Even if you're Bill Gates and you have billions of dollars to you're not going to be able to take care of some value decisions. Let's at least acknowledge that these are difficult value decisions and have a conversation, have a